Hello and welcome to the AVRUM ROSENSWEIG show.
Hello.
Welcome to one of the internet's best podcasts, where we dive deep into the lives of the extraordinary and fascinating people who leave an indelible mark on our world. Join us as we explore their captivating stories, remarkable achievements, and unique perspectives that shape history and inspire generations. Get ready to embark on a journey through the lives of inspiring people unlike any other.
Hello, folks, and welcome to the show. I'm delighted to be back with you, and I'm very, very excited about my guest today, Rabbi Dr. Minna Bromberg. How are you, Minna?
I'm doing well. I'm glad to be here.
Straight from Jerusalem, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, makes it even nicer. I understand that it's raining there, right?
Thank God. I once was scolded when the first year that we made aliyah, I was very much scolded by a taxi driver for complaining about the rain.
And you remember
I do
that?
not. Yes, one may not complain about the rain. It is a blessing, and thank God.
Amen. Amen. Although an Israeli was just telling me that it's a sort of a dark joke in Israel that people are more afraid of the rain than they are the missiles coming in. Is there any truth to that?
It's sort of there was one night last week where people were like, is it going to rain or is it going to be rockets? What's going to happen?
Yeah, right.
And of course, both of those are still possible. But I feel like at least for tonight, things seem, less rocket focused. We'll see.
I want to introduce you formally. Before I do, I just want to say that the Rambam, the Maimonides, says that when you do a mitzvah, when you do a good deed in Israel, that the outcome of it is even greater. Perhaps the reward is even greater. I feel when I do a podcast interview with someone in Jerusalem, with someone in Israel, I feel like it's an even greater opportunity for me and for my listeners. So thank you.
You're very welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, today on the podcast, I'm honored to welcome Rabbi Dr. Minna Bromberg, and she's the founder and president of what's called Fat Torah, a groundbreaking initiative working at the intersection of Jewish life, sacred text, and body liberation. Fat Torah's mission is both urgent and expansive: to end weight stigma in Jewish communal spaces, to train leaders and educators to confront fatphobia wherever it appears, including within ourselves, and to cultivate spiritual practices rooted in dignity, wholeness, and liberation for people of every body size. Rabbi Bromberg brings more than 3 decades of fat activism into deep conversation with Judaism, theology, and lived experience. Minna holds a PhD in sociology from Northwestern University. She was ordained at Hebrew College, has led a 250 family conservative congregation, released multiple albums of original music, made aliyah, and directed the Year in Israel program for Hebrew College rabbinical students. She's also a voice teacher who helps people reclaim their voices in prayer, work that beautifully echoes Fat Torah's insistence that every body, every voice truly belongs. Minna lives in Jerusalem with her husband, Rabbi Alan Abrams, and their 2 children, and her book, actually, which has come out, Everybody Beloved, A Call for Fat Liberation. Here it is. And I enjoyed it very much. In Jewish life, challenges us to rethink holiness, tradition, and belonging from the inside out. What a unique area that you've chosen to dive into. Is there anybody else in the world who's touching upon this area?
No, I mean, it's interesting. First of all, I feel like I became a rabbi because I thought of myself as a generalist. And it was like, what can I do where I could sort of do anything and it could be part of my rabbinate? And then, I suddenly found myself with this relatively specialist sort of focus that no one else was doing. So there are definitely people who are doing other work around sort of Torah of marginalized bodies. So people who are working on disability justice and Torah, and people certainly at this point, over 20-year tradition of queer Torah, where people from the LGBTQ community are sort of looking at how to bring themselves to Torah. And then there is also starting to be in the fat liberation space, other folks who are looking at questions around sort of fatness and theology from Christian and other perspectives, Christian and Muslim and feminist theology perspectives, but nothing specifically Jewish. So I have found myself in this unique spot and happy to be here.
I mean, what fascinated me about what you do, I was introduced to you by a mutual friend of ours, someone whom I actually know from the book. is that I wasn't quite sure to understand. I didn't know what to think of Fat Torah. And I asked some other people whom I know, friends of mine, what do you think Fat Torah is? And none of them got it, right? One woman just told me in my writer's workshop, she said, is it ensconcing yourself? Is it diving in very deeply into the learning of Torah? So I guess in some ways it is. There's an aspect of that. But give us a very clear definition, your mission statement, if you will, of what is Fat Torah.
Well, first of all, I think that, I'm happy to give a mission statement, which would be that we are here to shift the cultural conversation toward an understanding of weight stigma as a deep moral harm, and towards understanding Jewish wisdom as something that can help us heal that harm. So that's the mission statement. But I think that one thing that I love both about the word fat and about the word Torah is how open to interpretation they are and how rich that interpretive work can feel. So absolutely, I feel like part of this is also about fattening Torah in the sense of experiencing Torah as abundant and multitudinous and all of those wonderful things that fat can be when we know how to make it that.
It's also very compelling is that when you do some research into all of this, and as I did, and try to find out where is fat in the Torah, how does fat play out in the Torah? So a couple of examples. Eglon, the king of Moab, was called a very fat man in Judges 3:17.
Yeah.
Eglon melech Moab ish bari ma'od. Now, bari in modern Hebrew is translated to be healthy.
Yeah. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah, that is fascinating.
Right. So the word for a fat person or a fat animal is bari, which in modern Hebrew becomes the word for healthy. And obviously at the time of the Tanakh, it meant some combination of those two. Fatness was health and fatness was wealth, absolutely wealth, and abundance. And so I've asked a few different Hebrew experts about where in the development of Hebrew those words diverge, so that bari comes to mean health and not specifically fat. And I haven't gotten a good answer yet. Okay,
good. There is also a reference to the fat of the land, right? That chelev haaretz tochlu, which is in Genesis 45:18, you shall eat the fat of the land. Again, that's kind of reflective on a most very positive thing, not a pejorative thing, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think generally in Tanakh, fatness is seen as a positive. So you have that eating of the fatness of land. You have Isaac bestowing on both Jacob and Esau the blessings of the fatness of the land as part of his blessings to each of them. And fatness generally is seen as a blessing and a sign of abundance and wealth. And in the two places that I can think of where fatness is something that's criticized or derided, certainly King Eglon is an example of that. And then also in Dvarim, when we hear that Yeshurun grew fat and kicked.
Yes.
Right. There seems to be. So my take on both of those examples is that, well, in the Yeshurun grew fat and kicked, I think we tend to read it as Yeshurun, right? This name for the people of Israel had a problem. And the problem was that they grew fat and kicked. And the way I think it makes more sense to read it from what we know about fatness in Tanakh is that Yeshurun grew fat, right? They became wealthy. They became mighty. And then they kicked, and then they rebelled and forgot about the source of that wealth and that abundance. And the problem there is not so much the fatness, it's the complacency and the forgetfulness of God as the source of that abundance. So that's a very different take. And I think similarly in some ways for Eglon, right, his fatness is a way, he comes in a series of stories in Shoftim, including the story of Yael, right, where these stories of murders of powerful non-Jews for the sake of the people, and in all of those stories, there's this sense of the weaker party defeating the stronger party, right, and having this sort of miraculous defeat of an enemy who was trying to destroy us.
Mhm.
And so there, again, Eglon's fatness is absolutely being made fun of in Tanakh. I'm not denying that, but it's being made fun of because it's a sign of his wealth and his greatness and his power. And so that's a very different thing than what happens when we deride fat people today. One way of thinking of it, I think, is simply that what's changed is that in the time of the Tanakh, and really up until, I'm going to say, 200 years ago or so, maybe even 150 years ago or so, when people made fun of fatness, what they were doing was punching up, right? They were weaker folks who were using fatness to make fun of wealthy and powerful people. And when you have this shift, again, about 150 years ago, toward this sense of health as a personal obligation, it comes from the Protestant world, right? It's a sort of puritanical sense of, health as a sign that you're saved, health as a sign that you're sort of following God's ways, and thinness comes to be associated with that ability to curb desire, right? And all of those things that then become this very moralized way of looking at food and bodies. And really, ever since then, when people are making fun of fat people, they're punching down, right? They're using fatness to make fun of, certainly in a North American context, to make fun of immigrants. To make fun, absolutely. If you look at sort of narratives of, certainly in the Northeastern United States, of Jewish immigrants and Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants, there's all this sort of seeing them as fat, as if that's something about sort of their fertility being out of control, right? All of these fears about sort of immigrants.
Or fat and lazy, right?
Or fat and lazy, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's a wonderful book. There are two books actually that are very helpful to me in understanding this. One of them is a book by a scholar named Amy Farrell called Fat Shame, where she talks very much about this immigrant piece. And then a more recent book by a sociologist named Sabrina Strings, who wrote a book called Fearing the Black Body. It's all about the way that fatness and anti-Black racism, that anti-fatness and anti-Black racism are just, intertwined certainly in American history. So I think what happens in today's world is that sometimes people will still try to use making fun of someone's fatness as if they're punching up, right? As if they're making fun of quote unquote fat cats. But it sends the message to all of the rest of us who are not in positions of power and who may in fact be, facing the things that fat people face: discrimination in education and in hiring and in wages and all of those things. Sends the message everywhere that that's actually an okay thing to do because we're somehow not as deserving of that equal access to those things.
Minna, what was the fundamental thing that occurred within history when we went from punching up to punching down?
I think it really is this. You have this turn in the late 19th century toward coming out of these sort of Protestant health movements that really start seeing health as this personal moral obligation, and start associating thinness even more strongly with health. And I think that really is where it comes from. That then you start seeing people. I think that's pretty much where it comes from.
Interesting that a piece that I came upon is that there is no theology of thinness in Torah. Would that be correct?
Oh, I think that's absolutely true. In Torah, yeah. I mean, thinness is seen as, if you look, the word bari is also used to describe the fat cattle in Pharaoh's dream. Right. So absolutely there's a fear of thinness as being associated with poverty and starvation and famine. Yeah.
So it's actually lahafuch. There may be a theology, right? And there's no commandment to be thin, no moral hierarchy of bodies, no shame discourse around body size in the Torah.
Not that I've seen, no. I mean, there's funny stuff in Gemara about the fat rabbis in Gemara, right? Where I think it's clearly making fun of fatness, but again, it's making fun of fatness in a way that's about sexual joking about sexual prowess. Because it's not clear when they're talking about, how incredibly huge these fat rabbis' bellies were, right? It's not entirely clear whether they're actually talking about bellies, whether they're using belly as a metaphor for sexual organs, or whether both of those are associated in terms sort of like that a fat belly is a sign of great sexual desire or prowess, which they are making fun of, but again, not in this sort of, you ought to be ashamed of yourself kind of way.
Yes.
And Rabbi Yochanan, who's one of the fat rabbis, of course, is also talked about as being very beautiful. And so there's certainly, again, making fun of, but also this sense of fatness as associated, at least with male beauty.
So Rabbi Lazar ben Shimon was considered to have a very large body, which we find in Bava Metzia 83b. And the interpretation I got on that was Rabbi Lazar's son of Rabbi Shimon was unusual in his corpulence. I'm not sure what that means.
I mean, it means that corpulence is just another word for fatness. Okay. But you can see, I mean, anytime you're translating, right, you're translating using your current cultural lens.
One of the things that jumped out at me, and I'm sure you've been asked this question before, is that there's almost an understanding in society that you don't use the word fat, that you don't call people fat. In discussions with my son and I, where that may come up, he may say to me, Daddy, don't use that word. Or I might say to him, Daddy, son, don't use that word. Yet you've decided to actually focus on the word fat within the context of your teachings and the movement that you started. Why is that?
So first of all, I want to really acknowledge that I came into the work of fat activism after it had already been going on for a couple of decades. So in an organized way, at least in North America, fat activism started in the late 1960s.
Yes.
And they very clearly chose to sort of reclaim the word fat in the same way that Jewish people reclaim the word Jew, right? There have been times when we didn't want to call ourselves Jewish. We wanted to call ourselves, like Americans of the Hebraic faith or whatever it was, right? We were trying to sort of distance ourselves from the word Jew. And we can think of other words that have been used as slurs that then the marginalized group reclaims as either a morally neutral or even a morally positive way of describing themselves. Certainly the word queer has gone through that transformation in many circles that I'm in. And I think it comes from a few things. I think part of it is, I think this focus on sort of don't use that word. I just actually wrote a book chapter about this for an anthology that's going to be coming out hopefully next year. And I tell a story in there about my daughter being very upset because a fellow student at her school made fun of her for being fat. Now, I have to say that when kids make fun of each other for being fat, it's not necessarily clear that there's a correlation between the kids' actual body size, right? They use it as a slur for quite a wide range of bodies that many of us would not necessarily think of as fat. In any case, this kid made fun of her for being fat. When I went to pick her up at school, her teacher let me know that she had, really chastised this other girl who had made fun of my daughter. And how had she chastised her? By telling her, we never use that word. Mm-hmm. Which to me felt less like defense and standing up for my daughter and more like reinforcing the idea that it would be a horrible thing to actually be fat.
I hear you. Yeah.
And so some of it is just sort of a way of recognizing how much stigma there is around the word fat. That's one piece of it. Some of it, one of the nice things about the word fat is that it's also accurate, right? That it describes a particular kind of human body that's different than just being, taller, shorter, bigger, right? People have all these euphemisms around fat. And so it's also just a way of being accurate. And certainly, I think it can be morally neutral, but it can also, as we talked about a little bit earlier, right? If you're in a positive frame of mind about fatness or feeling good about fatness, it can also really open up this really rich linguistic possibility for the ways that fatness can appear in our human relations and in our theology. What would it mean to imagine God as fat? Right? That there's, a
very interesting imagery. With the coining of that phrase, Fat Torah, which again is very compelling, what sort of responses have you had to it?
I think that mostly folks who need it have been drawn to it.
Yeah.
So, and those have included both people who are coming out of a tradition of body acceptance and having it be a way to allow them to connect with Jewish tradition in ways that are affirming for them, and people who have had no connection with body acceptance before, but for whom Judaism is already important to them, and it's a way for their, for their Judaism to then become more body liberating. And I love both of those angles, I would say. I think I assumed that I was when I started this work, that I was sort of bringing fat liberation to Jewish life, and that was mostly what was happening. But at my book launch here in Jerusalem last month, I brought in a wonderful friend and who's a fat activist and scholar, Israeli here in Israel. And she spoke in Hebrew at my book launch about the book, which was, first of all, just amazing to sort of hear my work spoken about in Hebrew. I love that. Yes. But also just hearing her speak about how for her, who already has this background in fat activism, for her, it was a way of reconnecting with Masoret, with the tradition, in ways that she felt excluded from because of the way that bias against fat people showed up in her previous experiences with text study or synagogue life or those kinds of things. That for her, it was really a way of connecting with religion, with Jewish religion again, which was really moving to me and not something I had anticipated at all.
How was the book launch for you? What was that like?
It was so sweet. It was a winter night. It was actually hosted at the synagogue that I'm a member of, and there were about 30 people, and it was a mix of people who were there just because they like me personally, and folks who had heard about the book and wanted to be there for the launch of the book. And it included song, because I'm a singer and that's what I do, and that's part of this work for me. Song and singing together, and a dear friend who's a rabbinical student interviewed me and sort of did a great job of emceeing the evening. And then we had this speaker who spoke in Hebrew about the book and what it had meant to her. And it was really lovely to just be able to celebrate this point in a long journey.
For me, having grown up in a rabbinical home, my father was a bibliophile, and my sisters and I grew up on the spines of books. I could have told you when I was 5 years old that Martin Buber wrote I and Thou. Now, obviously, I couldn't tell you anything about the book, but I knew the spine of the book,
Yeah.
And therefore, to me, over time, the idea of authors, the idea of writing a book became a very holy thing to me. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's on my bucket list. It's something that I'm currently working on. Is there a holiness to this success of yours?
That's a great question. I think the first time I had some sense of sort of of what it would mean to, in Hebrew, this phrase works better, sort of finding a place on the Jewish bookshelf, like sort of taking your place in it. I first had a sense of that when a friend of mine, I have a dear friend who's a librarian at the National Library here in Jerusalem, National Library of Israel. And the library purchased a copy of my book. And my friend is part of the staff that catalogs books, right? So new books come in and they decide, where in the library this categorizing, where in the library this belongs. And she actually sent me a picture of my book with other books that had just been cataloged and were ready to go to the stacks. And I think that was when I felt like, wow, like I actually am, this work is joining the Jewish bookshelf. And that felt really powerful to me, and really, I think certainly some piece of writing a book is about, wanting our legacy to survive and wanting to have some sense of legacy. And, we think about, there's a tradition in certain parts of the Jewish world that authors become known by the title of their book, of their best book. Mm-hmm. And I would be perfectly happy to, be known as the everybody beloved. That would be just fine with me. Should it come to that? So
how did your little ones respond to the book?
I think they're pretty excited that, that I've written it and that, their Ima has a book. Certainly kids are not a fan of parents going away from them to do any kind of work. So that has, been the usual challenge that you would think. But in general, I think they're pretty proud. My younger one is very outgoing. He's like the family extrovert. And for a while, I had these flyers that I was passing out to various people to sort of remind them of when the book launch was. And we were at the mall one day, and I had the flyers there, like, in case I ran into anyone, because it's Jerusalem, you run into everyone. And he said, "Is there anyone here you know?" Like, he wanted to find someone to give out a flyer to. And I was like, "No, there's no one here I know. Like, it's random people at the mall." And then we saw someone who I knew because she was like the mother of another kid in My Daughter's Gone 6 years ago. And I was like, you know what, you could actually give one to her. He didn't know her at all, but he was so excited to like be in the mall and run up to this woman who he had never seen before and hand her a flyer, for the book and say, my Ima wrote this book. And so that's been fun to see.
Where's your rabbi husband with all this? How does he feel about your book?
I think he's also proud. He's certainly, been a big influence. I feel like we have, certainly been big influences on each other's thinking about Judaism. I think one thing that's been interesting is that we have a bit of a mixed marriage. And he's not like a fat liberationist originally. And so it's also been interesting to learn from him also about, what it means to support someone when you don't necessarily agree with 100% of what their views are. So I really appreciate both the support itself that he gives me and also learning, especially in, such a polarized time, what it means to actually maintain and grow in relationship with people who don't necessarily, sort of immediately pick up everything that we're laying down.
Is your husband fat?
Yeah.
And not meaning to be crass, and please, if I express this incorrectly, please let me know.
Mm-hmm.
Did people try to make a shidduch with you, a match with you, based on such things?
No, actually, I think I had a much more typical experience of the world of matchmaking, which is mostly that fat people are just ignored. Right,
are they?
People
they
don't.
Are?
Oh yeah, people never tried to match me up with anyone ever.
Oh, okay.
So I think it's more, and that's not me. Like, that's a very common experience that fat people are just sort of, and the world of sort of formal shidduch has its own whole set of issues around fatness, which I feel is, not mine to speak about since it's not my world. But I know that there are really interesting and painful conversations to be had with people in the parts of the Orthodox world where shidduch is really a more formal piece of how people form families. That there's some very painful stuff there around fatness. But in my world, it was more that, I was just never sort of set up with anyone. I think also that there are people who are specifically what's called fat attracted, right? That sort of their sexual preference is for fatness. I don't think either my husband or I would necessarily identify as fat attracted. So it wasn't like we were specifically looking for another fat person to be with.
Would that say then that, we all have a view of ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes I'll look at myself and go, oh, AVRUM, you're quite the intellectual, or you look good in a beard. You're a bearded sort of fellow, right?
Yeah.
When you look at yourself, in the
Mm-hmm.
wee hours of the nights, you're thinking of, who am I, Minna? Is part of that as being fat, or do you not see yourself in that context?
Well, I feel like, unlike many people in general, and certainly unlike many fat people, I've been approximately the same size since I was 19 years old.
Yes.
And so, I would say I don't feel like I'm someone who's sort of shocked by my image in the mirror. I think there are some people who are able to sort of accept themselves as long as they sort of imagine themselves at a smaller size.
Yes.
And if that works for them and that helps them get through their days, Baruch Hashem. And I don't feel at this point in my life anyway, like I'm sort of usually startled by my own fatness. I think I have a pretty good sense of my size, and I don't feel sort of, there's this whole question that I get asked a lot about sort of, I think there are a lot of assumptions that the work that I'm doing is primarily about sort of body image and one's relationship with one's own body. And absolutely that's a part of it. But I'm not really sure that it's the key part of it. And I think some of that is that there's often sort of this pressure within the sort of body positivity world that we should all sort of love our bodies and find ways to love our bodies. And I think it both kind of puts too much pressure on what, like, our relationship with our bodies is just as complex and just as potentially fluid as any other relationship in our life, and we should expect it to be that way. But I think it also sort of makes it seem as if all you need to do is love yourself. And, one thing I say in the book is that, like, my positive self-regard, my love for my own body has never manifested accessible seating or competent healthcare.
So you embrace yourself, you love who you are?
I would say that loving oneself, just like loving anyone else, is a practice.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
And is an ongoing practice. And so absolutely, I practice loving myself. And, one of the things about bodies, our own or anyone else's, is that they change. And so there's sort of no shortage of opportunities to kind of re-examine the relationship and, look at what we can do to repair the relationship if it becomes broken or things like that. So I've certainly had, sort of things that my body has done over the last 10 years that have been sort of new opportunities for me to practice self-compassion and to practice loving my body. I've given birth twice in the last 10 years. I had
Mazel tov.
Thank you.
Yes.
I had a really bad ankle break, which was like my first sort of, physical injury crisis ever, thank God, a few years ago, that sort of, gave me this whole other opportunity to think about kind of how I think about both fatness and also disability, right? That there's sort of this overlap between how we think about fat bodies and how we think about disabled bodies. And of course, there are plenty of disabled people who are fat and fat people who are disabled. So so my own sort of temporary disability when I broke my ankle was also like an opportunity to rethink some of my own, what I would think of as internalized anti-fatness and also internalized ableism. So I'd be like walking down the street with my crutch and I would have this thought arise. It was like, I hope people know that this is because I had a freak accident and broke my ankle, and it's not because I'm fat, which is like sort of an ableist thing to say to yourself, right? Like bodies should be able to move or not move however they're able without that, judgment from ourselves or others.
For you, what is the best case scenario in your thinking about yourself and your body? If you could wake up tomorrow and be X, what would X be?
I think for me, it's more a question of, I would love to wake up tomorrow in a world that provided equal access to employment and education and healthcare for people, regardless of their body size. And I don't, I think we tend to, again, to think of fatness as something that is someone's fault, and that the way to sort of deal with the stigma of fatness is to try to get yourself out of that category.
Yes.
And absolutely, I don't, fault anyone who takes that sort of individualized route of getting away from that kind of stigma by making their body smaller or by trying to make their body smaller, because it doesn't usually work. But, I don't fault anyone for that. But I think really, one of the things that really made me fall in love with sociology as a teenager was this understanding of what's called the sociological imagination, which is understanding how personal problems are part of larger social forces. And I think that really allowed me, not just around fatness, but around other ways that I felt lonely or isolated or marginalized, to start thinking about what does it mean to to understand that I'm not alone in this, and that this is actually a larger social or political problem that might have other solutions than just me trying to fit into someone else's box.
So I am about, excuse me, about 240 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
According to, the list that we read and the information that we study, I should be about 180 pounds.
Mm-hmm.
So health-wise, I'm considered to be obese.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that play out? Well, it's not unusual for people whom I know and sometimes strangers to come over and rub my tummy.
Wait, I'm sorry.
Yeah, as if I'm a genie. Or to comment as if I'm jovial, which I actually am jovial, but because of my weight, right?
Yeah.
Now, we wouldn't do that to people who are have other sort of challenges in life, and I would like personally to bring my weight down for my health, for my longevity. I want to be around for my son, and I think it'd probably be better if I could do that. And tell me if I'm right about that. But why do people feel as though it's okay to do that?
Okay, so there's a lot in there. Let me talk about the health piece
Unpack
first.
it, yeah.
All right. I think that, this question of like, would it be better for any one individual's longevity to attempt weight loss? The problem is we don't know the future. And we don't know whether, and we're also, like, as human beings, horrible at understanding how statistics on the group level play out in our individual lives, right? So, like, people in the fat acceptance world will often, or in the sort of what's called health at every size, which is more of a sort of movement among doctors and dietitians around what's called weight neutral healthcare. They'll often cite the statistic that is a statistic that's been confirmed in like 70 years of studies now, that about 95% of attempts at weight loss result in, over like a 5-year period, the weight being regained, if not more weight being gained above what the starting point was. And I think they often cite that as a way to say, and therefore you shouldn't diet, or, you shouldn't try to lose weight. And I think part of what's problematic about that is that it makes it seem as if that's how people actually understand statistics in their everyday life. Because if 95% of diets fail, which we have a lot of evidence that they do, that means that 1 in 20 succeed. And of course, all we see, especially in social media now, right, is all of these like people who lost these huge amounts of weight and have kept it off for so long, and they're social media influencers and they're getting it right. And it's not that hard to find the 1 in 20. Like, if in our own lives, we probably know many multiples of 20 people who have tried to lose weight, and for each of those multiples of 20, there'll be one who actually like kept it off in the long term. And of course, because it's so freighted, and because we want to live long and well and healthily, of course it makes sense to imagine ourselves in the 5% and not in the 95%. Like, that's a very natural thing to do.
Yes.
And I think I started to understand that better when I was going through fertility treatments, because there too, right, it's this outcome that is so incredibly deeply desired, right? The desire to be a mother when that's really what you want, and to not be able to do that without help, is such a deep desire that I almost feel in a medical context like it's not fair to expect that people are actually giving informed consent, because the desire is so great that all of the statistics about whether this is going to work or not, and all the statistics about side effects and possible damage that can be caused by these treatments, feels in the moment like blah, 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 the fine print, just give me the baby, right? Or like blah, 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 the fine print, just give me a smaller body. And we're so willing to sort of, and my, like, I went through fertility treatments I went through IVF with my doctors, like drawing these charts, being like, well, at your size, the chance of you actually having a baby is, this big. And I would be like, well, that looks like more than 0. So let's do this. Right?
Yes.
Because, I wanted to imagine, of course, that I was in that tiny percentile for whom it would work. And it did. But that's not the point. The point is that I think it's so hard for us when the outcome of an unsure thing is so desirable, it's really hard for us to be sort of rational calculators of what's in our own best interest. So that's the medical piece. I think what gives people the permission to do that? First of all, I don't think sometimes people talk about fat phobia as the last acceptable stereotype or the last acceptable prejudice, which is not true, right? Like, we know that there are plenty of other groups that face horrible systemic issues.
Yeah.
And on sort of the one-to-one level, I certainly think that that many folks in those marginalized groups also experience folks coming up to them and being inappropriate. And if we don't hear about it, it's because there's shame around talking about it. Or because we're not listening, one of those two. I recently had someone who wrote, I think, a really lovely review of my book. But my book has these letters in between each of the chapters that are like mostly sort of my responses to people not being nice to me because of my body size, or like sort of more personal responses to those kinds of incidents. And this reviewer, who, again, I think did a wonderful job, I'm very grateful for the review that she wrote, but she said something about, and it's even a bit much, right? Like that these letters were sort of a bit much. And I think that's because it's hard for people who don't live these experiences to sort of have to hear about them over and over. Oh, you're talking again about the chairs. They didn't have chairs that fit you. Like, why did you write a whole chapter in your book about chairs? And then this morning, I had to go for a hearing test. And I went to the hearing clinic, and there were no chairs that I could actually sit in the waiting area. And I had seen on my way to the hearing clinic that down the hallway there was a bariatric clinic. And I thought, I bet the bariatric clinic has seating that's fat friendly. And I went down and I stole one of the chairs from the bariatric clinic and brought it to the waiting area of the hearing clinic. And so for me, that's a great example. That's not the sort of people coming up to and being rude, but for me, it was a great example of like, wait, we think fat people deserve equal access to healthcare when they're trying to not be fat anymore, but somehow they don't deserve equal access to healthcare when they're like just trying to get their hearing checked. So that's sort of on the systemic level. I think on the level of, people coming up to us and being inappropriate. First of all, I just want to acknowledge that at least for me, again, even though I feel like I have a very loving relation with my body, it hurts every single time.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Yeah, it does. And I think people really don't understand that. It hurts every single time. And part of what's been amazing for me living in Israel, people think of Israelis as very sort of in each other's business, because we are.
Yeah, they are.
And the level of like strangers coming up to me and being inappropriate around what I think of as inappropriate around my size is about the same as it is when I'm in North America, which to me says something about how horrible anti-fatness is in North America, that like in parts of the country where no one would actually start a conversation with a stranger, they will still come up to you and say something shitty. Sorry, am I allowed to swear? About your size. I mean, Boston. I spent, 5 years of my life in Boston, not a place known for strangers speaking to one another.
Yes.
But absolutely people would give me unsolicited weight loss advice, even in Boston. Yeah.
Minna, there are going to be people who are going to watch this interview, and their response to what we're talking about here is, come on, lose weight. Lots of ways of doing it. And I would just say from my own personal experience, God, I've tried.
Yeah.
I've tried many, many times.
Mm-hmm.
And I get to the point where I feel like I can't do it. I can't lose weight. I don't want to go through surgery. I really don't. Because of the possibilities of the danger. And I just don't want to be that person who has to go through surgery to cut back my weight. What do you say to people who challenge you with like, Minna, come on, just work harder?
So I think there are two pieces of it. One, they clearly don't actually understand the statistics, right? That when we're making individual choices about our health, we're usually making them against a background of what we know about what has worked for other people. They really don't understand the statistics, right? They're seeing those success stories which are like the 1 in 20. And they want me to spend my life imagining that I'm in that 5%.
Yes.
And I think what it really comes down to for me is how we want to live our lives and how we want to prioritize what's important to us in life. And I think that even those people, those rare people who lose weight and sustain that weight loss, from what I've seen, and I could be wrong, but from what I've seen, for the majority of those people, it's because they're obsessive about maintaining that weight loss. And when we obsess about one thing, it keeps us from being able to spend our time and energy and attention on other things. And, you know, when I think about, it's not the time of year for this, but one of my favorite ways to think about Rosh Hashanah, and particularly about all of the king imagery, all of the sort of sovereign imagery in Rosh Hashanah, is that it's an opportunity to think about what we want to be sovereign in our lives. This is not original to me, but I sadly don't remember who I got it from. What is it that we want to be sovereign in our lives? What is it that we want to give our power over to, or give our devotion to in our lives? And that Rosh Hashanah is an opportunity for sort of re-choosing, have I been spending my life in a way that honors what I actually want to be sovereign in my life, what I actually want to be holy in my life? Or have I been sort of frittering it away on whoever says I should actually be paying attention to X, Y, or Z? And an opportunity to sort of reassert what I actually want to be royal and praiseworthy in my life, and pursuing weight loss. And again, I use the term pursuing weight loss because losing weight is not an activity. Right? Pursuing weight loss is a set of activities. But this idea that you should just lose weight as if it's an action that one can take, right? Yes. Like, that is not an activity. You know, pursuing weight loss, engaging in various activities to attempt to lose weight, those are activities. And they're activities that I engaged in obsessively, and to the detriment of my mental and spiritual health, and to the detriment, I think, really of my development as a human being from the age of 7 to the age of 16. And by the time I was 16, I was done. And I realized that I did not want to spend my life that way anymore. I didn't like my body at that time. I didn't know that there was any such thing as fat acceptance or fat liberation. I just knew that I was not willing to do that to myself anymore. I was not willing to live my life that way anymore. I was sad that my childhood had been really taken up with self-hatred and feeling like I didn't know why I couldn't accept myself. I didn't know why I couldn't succeed at weight loss when I had succeeded at so many other things that my sort of nerdy, ambitious little girl self had succeeded at. And somehow, thank God, really, by the time I was 16, I understood that I was not willing to spend my life that way anymore.
Kol hakavod to you. Do you remember the faces? Do you remember the voices? Do you remember some of the names of people who have been nasty toward you? Or have you figured out how to forgive?
I don't know that I've figured out how to forgive, but I think it's so common that I don't think, with a few exceptions of people who are sort of recalcitrant and still in my life, I don't think that I hold a lot of individual blame for people enacting what is so culturally acceptable. And so I don't feel like I feel a lot of animosity usually towards those folks, because I know that in most cases they're, just doing what society expects them to do. I certainly will try to set boundaries and not expose myself to people who, again, are recalcitrant about it. But I don't feel like I sort of particularly, bear grudges against folks who've said mean things to me.
It's so interesting about the societal aspect of it. You make me think about other components of how we were brought up, many of us anyways. Many of us heard when we were growing up, "Come on, mama, come eat, you'll feel better."
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of that, and you're right that society feeds into that. I think the negativity around so much of our bodies, if they're not what the narrative is supposed to be out there, what the imagery is supposed to be. But I want to, in our last few minutes here, I want to talk about Torah a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yay.
What is it to be a Jew? To me, it's AVRUM leaving HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God, for a moment and saying, "Excuse me, God, thank you for come visit me after my Brit Milah, my circumcision, but there are strangers passing by, and I want to make sure that they're well fed, and I want to make sure that I clean their feet. I want to make sure that they drink." When people say to me, "What is it for you to be a Jew?" It is pursuing chesed. It is pursuing kindness.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about chesed within the context of your writings.
Well, chesed, another word for chesed in the mystical context is, of course, gedulah.
Yeah.
Right? A synonym for chesed is gedulah, which means largeness. And so there's absolutely this sense of chesed, again, in sort of chesed as a divine attribute that we can try to imitate, that's about overflowing boundaries, that's about being abundant and sharing abundantly and loving abundantly, and sort of an unlimited quality to love. And I think that absolutely, when I think about our human capacity for compassion, that I would love it if my sort of physical fatness could teach me and anyone else of any size a lesson about what it means to love abundantly and what it means to love abundance, and to not be afraid of that, right? That of course, again, in both the mystical tradition and in sort of our social actions, chesed needs proper channeling into the world. Because boundless love can do all kinds of crazy things also.
Correct.
But that we also don't want to have a very well-constructed channel and no goodness to flow through it. And so, absolutely, for me, chesed, first of all, it certainly does start with acceptance of myself, and not just my body, but acceptance of this moment as it is, acceptance of this realm of reality as it is. And this comes back also to my work when I'm working with voice students, that so often the students who come to me are people who are not musicians, but they've been called to be prayer leaders, or they've joined a program that's asking them to be a prayer leader. And suddenly they have to use their actual voices, which of course come from their actual bodies. And most of the people who find me because they don't really like those voices. And often there's a feeling when we first start working together that they would really like it if I could just teach them how to have a different voice than the one they have.
No, interesting.
Right? And I can't do that, right? I can teach them to work and to sound better with the voice that they do have. But for me, that always starts with a willingness to be with what we already have. One line that I often come back to, like for a while, it was my sort of mantra, like on Yom Kippur afternoon, when I would be, being a kolbo, and like where I would be, like leading the davening and chanting Torah, like everything. And Yom Kippur, of course, is quite the marathon for that. And at some point, I would come back to the Leonard Cohen line, "Ring the bell that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." And so, sorry, I'm tearing and breaking myself up here, right? That, like, what does it mean to start from that place?
Yes.
Of finding the aspect of ourselves and of everyone else and of humanity and of this world. But what is the bell that still can ring?
What makes you cry?
Because I think that we don't have enough of this in the world, and I want there to be more of it. And I feel really hugely blessed to be able to be a channel for that in the world.
Yeah, kol hakavod. Can you tell me an instance or a situation where your work has really helped somebody?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of actually of the other rabbis I've heard from,
Yeah.
who have really felt, like there's so much in the spotlight. And there's so much, seen, whether they don't see themselves that way, but really sort of seen as like a stand-in for God.
Mhm.
And there's, sort of so much expectation and spotlight. And, just when I hear from people who feel like, I heard from a rabbi when the book first came out, that they had read the book, and they're not someone who I would have ever expected this from, because they're not in a fat body, but they talked about the role that anti-fatness and sort of the incredible scrutiny that comes along with it, how that played out in their family, and how it sort of tainted a lot of the relationships in the family, again, in some ways regardless of body size, because of the sort of policing of the body, and how healing they found the book itself as a way of healing from some of the damage that had done in their own life and the life of their family. That was very moving, again, especially because it wasn't someone who I knew would have been able to tell from looking that was something that they dealt with.
My father, God bless his soul, he was fat. He was fat.
Mm-hmm.
Is there something about that amongst rabbis? Is there? It might be a strange question, but I just wanted.
Right. Is there more fatness among rabbis than other? I don't know. That's never occurred to me. I think there's certainly, in today's sort of modern rabbinate, I think there's probably plenty of pressure to not be fat.
To not be. Yeah.
And I've heard horror stories from rabbinical students about part of the career advice that they got from mentors within their rabbinical schools being around weight loss.
That's prevalent in that environment, you're saying?
Yeah, that people would get unsolicited, like when people were sort of getting ready to go on the job market, that part of what people would tell them was that they should lose weight.
When you were head of a conservative shul with 250 members, was it, or families?
Families, yeah.
Did that ever come into play as a rabbi, both personally? In other words, you're standing up there on Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, or standing up there on Shabbat and making a sermon of Devar Torah.
Mm-hmm.
Do you watch people watch you, or were you able to go past that?
I mean, I think generally when I'm worried about people's scrutiny, I try to come back, and this for me is also connected sort of mystically with chesed. I try to come back to this ability that I think all of us have to live from the inside out rather than living from the outside in, and sort of thinking about, what do I look like and what does their looking at me look like? And right. So for me, that's definitely a practice of coming back to living from the inside out. Which I think is also a great, I think I put this in the book, that to me, it's also one way that we can interpret Yetziat Mitzrayim, that it's a way of sort of living out from the narrowness of our own perspective, but living from the inside out into out. So that's one sort of practice that I engage in. But in terms of what actually sort of happened in that rabbinate, I did have this very early on when I started at that congregation. It was a conservative shul, which, at least in that place and time, meant that they loved the idea of having a rabbi who didn't drive on Shabbat, even though they all did. So not all. And it, that was fine with me because I don't drive on Shabbat. But that meant that I lived, and they also had a shul, again, like a lot of shuls, certainly in North American, sort of northeastern small cities, where the community has moved quite a distance from the shul. Right, the shul is in the old part of the city, and the community has moved to the suburbs. And so the housing that we found was about a 2-mile walk from the shul, which at that, was fine with me at that point in my life. That wasn't such a big deal. Again, in the same body size that I have now. And, but they were also a bit concerned about me because of the walk, because they felt that it went through bad neighborhoods. So there was like a lot of conversation about my walk to shul and how was it okay. And at one point, one congregant came up to me and, asked how long the walk was. And I said, oh, it's about, 2 miles each way. And she said, that's going to be so good for you.
Really? Well, what did you respond? Do you remember?
I have no recollection of what I responded, but like the idea that I would like arrive somewhere and take a job where I lived at a distance that I couldn't comfortably walk and somehow figure that like it would be good for me and I'd get into shape in order to do the walk was like, who would do that to themselves? Like,
right.
I took this job knowing how far the shul was from where I was likely to live. And it wasn't like as if it were something new for me, right? As if her assumption was that I had always been like sitting on the couch at home, and now I was suddenly going to be like getting up on Shabbos morning and learning how to walk 2 miles each way. Yeah. So that was pretty horrible, I think, to say. But again, like she meant, like what's so wild about it is that she genuinely meant that, like she thought that would be a good thing for me. Like she meant that.
I find that you're very generous of spirit. I really do. And I want to ask you, do you feel like you're brave and courageous in what you've done?
I do. I mean, before 25 years ago, when I was very much wanting to learn how to meditate. And I lived in Chicago at the time. And it's not true anymore, but at the time, there was no one doing Jewish meditation. And so even though I, wanted to stay within my own tradition, I ended up with, as so many Jews have done in the last 70 years, ended up with some lovely Buddhists. And they were a kind of Buddhists that often talk about, they were Shambhala Buddhists who often talk about warriorship. And sort of this idea of the meditator as a warrior. And what I loved about that was that their definition of warriorship was one who was unafraid to be oneself.
Very good.
And they also have an idea about fearlessness that, doesn't actually mean that you're not feeling fear, but that you're practicing doing the thing through that while feeling that fear. And absolutely that sense of sort of being willing to be with what is and being willing to be ourselves in the world does feel also like a warriorship or a braveness practice to me. But I think what's tricky about it is it's so easy to think that you can fake that. Yes. And think that you can sort of get ahead of your own vulnerability. And it turns out that you can't, or at least not for very long.
And you cannot. I think.
And so I definitely, I feel brave, and I also feel, more vulnerable than I've ever felt. And
it's very honest. I also, in that light, I felt for a long time, and I talk about this in the environments where I teach, that there's a lot of emphasis in Judaism on ben adam lechavero, how you're supposed to be towards your friend. And there's certainly a ton of discussion around ben adam lamakom, which is how you are, your relationship with God. Yeah. But we kind of forgot along the road about ben adam la'atzmi.
Yeah. I mean, even when we say v'ahavta kamocha, we just assume like the kamocha part must be fine, but you must already be loving yourself. What's the worry? Right. When in fact, for most of us, that's the hardest part.
I've been playing around with AI for a number of months, and I quite love it. And I ask it every time I have a guest on to produce an ode to. So I have an ode to Minna Bromberg. Today, a door opens not with keys of power, but with breath, with bodies arriving as they are. Today, Torah widens. Rabbi Dr. Minna Bromberg steps forward carrying scrolls, not only of parchment, but of lived flesh. 3 decades of resistance stitched into prayer, activism braided with blessing. She calls it Fat Torah, 2 words that refuse to apologize, that sit beside one another until the room must rearrange itself. Fat Torah says, Holiness does not require shrinking. Wisdom does not live in narrow chairs. God does not measure souls by circumference. It trains eyes to notice where stigma hides behind politeness, where sanctuary is bruised without meaning to, where we have learned quietly to make war with our own reflections. Minna brings sociology into the Beit HaMidrash, music into the margins, voice into plagues taught with whisper. She has led congregations, crossed oceans, made Jerusalem home, and still asks the most ancient question, who gets to belong? As a voice teacher, she teaches prayer to rise from the belly, to vibrate through ribs, to remind us that breath itself is already a form of permission. Her book, Everybody Beloved, is not a slogan. It is a theological demand, a refusal to let tradition remain untouched by those it has wounded. This is Torah read aloud by bodies that were told to be quiet, justice spoken in full voice, embodiment as covenant. This conversation is an invitation to unlearn shame, to read sacred texts with liberated eyes, to build Jewish spaces where no one must disappear to be seen. Every body, every voice, beloved. Nice, huh?
So beautiful. Yeah.
Isn't that lovely?
Mhm.
I really enjoyed this a lot, and I thank you so much for being my guest. You really are a lovely human being, and I just learned so much from you. And actually, I'll be honest with you, that I think the greatest measurement in this interview is that I'm feeling a bit better about myself.
Yay.
Yeah. So thank you for that.
Yeah. You're so welcome. Thanks for making this space. It's beautiful.
It's a kavod. It's an honor. Where can people find your book?
They can find my book anywhere they like to buy books, but if they go to minnabromberg.com, then a little pop-up will come that tells them my very favorite place to buy it, which is bookshop.org. Not sure they ship to Canada though, so buy it wherever you can, certainly on Amazon and all those other places.
Okay.
And yeah, visit me at minnabromberg.com and on Facebook and Instagram. I'm pretty easy to find.
And come visit you in Jerusalem.
Absolutely.
All right. I'm Yisrael Chai, folks. Proud to be a Jew. And here's another addition to it. And I think people will really, really enjoy and benefit from what Minna has brought to the Jewish world and to the world at large. So thank you so much for doing what you do. It really, really is special. Really special.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all very much for listening and for watching. I'm very grateful for that. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. You can see my email address at the bottom of the screen. I'd love to hear from you. If you have any ideas for guests, any questions about this interview, I will definitely respond to you. Until then, as my mother used to say, sei gesund, just go in good health. And we will do this again soon. Thank you so much.